what you will need to, how you tend the vineyard. And really the reason why all these viticultural practices are key is because what we want to deliver at the end of the ripening season for harvest is that we've got ripe and mature grapes. Now, when we look at the composition of grape wines and in specific the berries, then there are a few interesting elements that we will be touching on, because throughout the winemaking process, these are the ones that we will be working with, or at least we'll be focusing on these. So the first and foremost consideration is to ensure that there is sufficient ripeness in the grapes, and that is through the sugar content. So that is absolutely key when you make the decision about the time of the harvest. At the same time, you are not only interested in sugar in itself, but how it is in balance with other constituent components. So these would be acidity, and also in addition, specifically in black grapes, when we make red wine, it's important to remember what we call the phenolic maturity. So phenols are the chemical compounds that are mostly found in the skins, and that's what is interesting to us. But also phenolic compounds can be found in the pips, so the seeds, and also in the stalks. So normally when we decide the time of the harvest, then I have mentioned during one of the sessions last time that the viticulturist or the grape grower would use a little implement called the refractometer. Refractometer is practically based on the weight of the juice, can tell you the sugar ripeness. However, at the same time, you are also interested in the taste, because the best way to be able to measure the balance and establish whether your grapes are ready for harvest is just to taste. So whether you've got sufficient acidity, freshness on the palate, and also when you get the chance to crush the seeds or the pips on the palate with or with your teeth, and grind it in between and feel it on your tongue, that's when you will feel what the nature of those tannins are. If the tannins are very much reminiscent of an overly brewed green tea, which is normally quite gripping and quite greenish, then your ripeness of phenolic ripeness is still not sufficient. Now, ideally, what you will be experiencing is that there is a good balance in between sugar, acidity, and phenols. I have mentioned that the phenolic compounds are in three areas, so the skin, the pip, and the stalk. And what we are interested in winemaking mostly, what we want to be able to extract from the berries, is in the skin. However, we must remember that also the other two parts of the grape contain phenols, because the techniques we will be using will impact how much of those we are extracting. And the tannins in the pips and the stalks are normally very green, very harsh, unpleasant, and that's what we want to avoid extracting. And lastly, just to reflect on that, of course, the flesh of the berry will contain the sugar and the acidity dissolved in the liquid, in water, and that's where most of the weight of the berry is. So these are the parts that we are going to be working with. We have discussed during the previous session that fermentation is practically an exothermos process, so it generates heat throughout fermentation that we will need to be able to deal with. And at the heart of fermentation is the very simple transformation of sugars into ethanol or alcohol. And this we perform with the help of yeast, which we will be either using as indigenous yeast that are ambient in the air and in the cellar. And this is when you talk about wild fermentation or wild yeast fermentation. So it is wild yeast because it's ambient in the air. Or you may be inoculating. So inoculating meaning that you get commercially produced selected strains of yeast, and that you add some juice, almost as when you're in your baking class, you add milk to yeast when you make a yeasty dough. Then that yeast starts to grow, and you add that to the grape juice. Now, when I talk about commercial yeasts or selected yeasts, then it's really important to just stop for a second and think about what the differences are between wild yeast and commercial yeast. Is one better than the other? Now, when you talk about ambient yeast from the cellar, then it's clear that as a winemaker, you're not able to make a decision about which strains of yeast you will be introducing into your wine, but whatever is ambient in the air, and that's why it is what we call wild fermentation. As opposed to the commercial one, where you're able to select, or the producer of the yeast was able to select which strain of the yeast they are using, because yeasts behave differently. Some of them will be able to ferment sugars into alcohol at very low temperatures. Some of them will require higher temperatures. So, for example, when you're in the cellars in Champagne or in Burgundy, in cooler northern cellars, then it may well be important that you're focusing on the use of really low temperature yeasts, which are able to ferment even in cooler cooler weather. Whereas some of the yeasts will be really heat resistant, so they will be able to ferment out at much higher temperatures. So, for example, if you're making Shiraz in the Barossa, then you may be choosing that. Also, there will be differences between yeast strains, for example, how fast or how slowly they go through fermentation, as well as they will be different, for example, based on their alcohol resistance. So some of the yeast strains will be dying out quite quickly as the alcohol is being produced. Some of them will be able to keep on fermenting your must into wine even as the alcohol level is increasing and is at a higher level. So that will again be a consideration for you as a winemaker to make, which yeast strain you will use. Having said all this and having discussed the different aspects of yeast strains, you may also be now thinking that actually when you're working with selected or commercial yeasts, then you're able to focus and control your fermentation much more suited to the needs of your winery, of your region, of your climate, as opposed to having the indigenous white fermentation where you don't know how those yeasts which get into your cellar will be working. Of course, there is a difference in between, because when you are a very small producer, then you may well be able to run wild fermentations in smaller quantities very efficiently. Whereas if you're a bigger commercial, a bigger producer who has larger quantities, there you will want to be able to control the output much more clearly in terms of what the style is going to be like, and you want to eliminate all risks. And risk is also rising from, of course, having a less controllable fermentation process. Now, what the reality is today is that large producers tend to use commercial yeast, but nonetheless, in so-called smaller portions, what they call smaller batches, they will be probably using white fermentation for the sake of being able to get what they call more interesting or exciting flavors, and then blend those smaller batches in with larger ones to kind of introduce a bit more color and element to it, color in terms of interest, I mean. But in the next few slides, what we are going to look at is the detailed winemaking technique for white, rosé, and red wines, because I think it is really important to go through each wine style and also have a look at their specific winemaking steps. So the starting point is really that we've got the harvest. As we said, we establish the harvest date based on our sugar maturity, the grapes having a good level of freshness through acidity, and as well as having the phenolic ripeness. Now, when the picking happens and the grapes are being delivered in the winery, then the next step, the first step really is that they will get onto a selection table or triage table. And the selection table will allow us to get any unwanted elements out. So any leaf that has been mixed in with the bunches of grapes, any berries or bunches which are not healthy. So for example, if there is any rot or mildew or anything, then those are selected out. And then the moving table or conveyor belt will get these into a destemmer. I put the destemming into brackets because there will be winemakers who may decide that actually they want to retain the berries on the cluster and have some more phenolic compounds introduced so that there is an increased tannin level in the wine. But in white wines, typically they will be destemmed. So the berries will be removed from the stalk of the cluster. And the reason being is the harsh nature of those tannins that I mentioned. So by removing and working only with the berries, we have actually made the necessary step to protect our wine from becoming overly tannic. Because as with white wines, what you definitely want to avoid is having a gripping, unpleasant mouthfeel, right? So that's the destemming. And after destemming, the berries may actually be opened up by going through a crusher and then getting into the press. So by crushing the grapes, we let the juice run free, and that juice is normally separated straight away and put into our tank or barrels, and we'll be protecting that there from oxygen. Remember, last time when we talked, I mentioned that when you cut a slice of apple, for example, and you put it on the kitchen counter, it will start to interact with oxygen, so it will start to oxidize, and that means that the color is going to start to turn from a light yellow, watery yellow, into a brownish garnet color. Now that's why we want to protect the so-called free run juice, so that it's not going to start to turn garnet, and it's also not going to develop those oxidized flavors. We'll have the crushed berries, which contain still a lot of the juice that we want to use for winemaking. And that's why we'll be introducing it into the next step, into a press. Now, presses come in quite a few different formats. The one that you can see on this slide in step number 2 is what is called a pneumatic press. Presses may be operated by either applying the pressures through pneumatics, and practically you've got this cylinder on its side, and in which you've got a massive rubber seal that is being pumped with air and is decreasing in size. So that's how the pressing happens. But there will also be the classic so-called basket presses that you can use, and in larger wineries you may also find what is called a screw press, a continuous screw press. That's normally the difference between these presses is how gently or how harshly they will be treating the fruit. And as you may suspect, as much as we wanted to remove the stalks, we also want to be able to control how we press and how much pressure we apply in the basket, in the press, so that we can avoid crushing the pips, which again contain very harsh polyphenols, so very harsh tannic in nature. So we have extracted the juice after the pressing, and that's when you arrive at step number 3, where you can see the tank. And that is practically the settling or the clarification of the juice. The juice itself is not a clear and bright liquid as you may think, but it is a quite murky, grey, dark liquid. And the reason is because there are lots and lots of small particles suspended in this liquid that if you allow some time, normally about 24 hours, then it nicely sinks or to the bottom of the tank and settles down. That's why normally for the first 24 hours during settling or clarification, you chill the must, so your grape juice, to a very low temperature to avoid oxidation and any fermentation to kickstart. Now, once you've got a clear juice, then you will start alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation, as we said, will be either with wild yeast or commercial yeast. And throughout the process, we want to control the temperature. The very fine ethers, so the aromatic compounds that carry the flavor in white wine, and which are normally associated with the fruity flavors, are very volatile. So if these are kept at a higher temperature, then they practically evaporate quite easily, and you will be losing that fine fruity nature of the wines. That's why white wines are normally fermented at a lower temperature. Now, lower temperature means that you will need to be quite careful, because the yeast to remain active and to work their magic of transforming sugar into alcohol, they need normally a certain amount of warmth. So that's why quite a great care needs to be taken when you do white wine fermentation. So you don't want it too cold, but also you want to avoid it to be too warm, for the sake of keeping those fine fruity flavors. Once the alcoholic fermentation is finished and there is no more sugar left, and you've completely fermented out into a bone dry white wine, then it will be a question of what you want to achieve with the wine. Is this going to be a wine that you will age? So are we talking about maybe a higher quality Chardonnay from Burgundy or California's Napa Valley? Are we talking about an age-worthy Riesling? Or are we talking about a wine that we want to produce in an early drinking style, and therefore there is no aging requirement, because what we want to achieve is that the wine is fresh, useful and crisp, and therefore instead of aging, we go on to straight away the fining and clarification, which we are going to talk about in a bit. So practically what we want to achieve during fining and clarification and filtering is that we've got a bright, light, attractive liquid in the glass at the end that we can then bottle. So that is really our winemaking, white winemaking process in technical terms. And then let's have a look at what considerations we need to make when we talk about rosé wines. Now, with rosé wines, clearly there is a major difference, and the major difference is that we want to achieve a rosé or a pink color, whether that is a very light, whether it's a more pronounced pink, and whether that pink is more sort of the peach, onion skin, salmon, or is it more a cherry type of pink, which will be also partly dependent on the grape variety that we use, and then the depth of the color will be very much dependent on the winemaking technique. Now, rosé wines are made from black grapes to start with, so that's an important difference compared to winemaking. And most of the time, I'm saying most because there will be, of course, winemakers who leave it on stem, but the grapes will be destalked and destemmed. and then they move on to, so that is on this slide called stripping, and then it will be going on to the crushing stage. Again, at the heart of this is that we want to start to release the juice from the grape berry. Now then, straining is going to be in 3 different options, because there are practically 3 different ways how you can make rosé wines. One of them, the first option is when we call that we are bleeding off, or with the French word Honigh method. So in this instance, what happens is that practically when you're making red wine and you have destemmed and crushed and you've got the juice and the berries in a tank, then the juice and the berries normally separate. So the berries will be floating on top in the tank and you've got the juice in the bottom part. So what you do is that after a certain period of time, when the juice has got a bit of the color from the skin, then you bleed off, or that is the French word Honigh, and you take a slightly pink tainted must off from the tank. Now, why is this practiced by red wine makers? It's very simple, because by taking juice off early, you take off the liquid, so you can concentrate the red wine better, and at the same time you will also have this liquid there that you can make into rosé wine. Normally quite light, delicate, and completely untannic, because it's quite quickly that you take the juice off. Then there can be also what is often called the purpose-made rosé wines. So instead of taking juice off, you actually will be just pressing after the crushing the berries fairly quickly, or after a short maceration, and you extract more color, and that is a purpose-made rosé, because it's not a kind of byproduct of your red winemaking, but you really focus on making that rosé. And then there is also the so-called Vin Gris method, which is practically when lighter colored black grapes are immediately taken off with very, very short skin contact, and therefore it is an almost white wine, but very, very lightly tainted, and that's why it's called a grey wine if you translate the French, because it will be very modest in terms of color. So what you end up with is practically that you've got a very lightly or maybe slightly more pinkish colored juice that you will be working with, and then it's pretty much going back to a white wine making process, in terms of that you want to make sure it settles down, that there will be a clarity of the wine. Alcoholic fermentation will take place. Aging, and I put there if any, because with most rosés, what we want to achieve is that there is a bright pink, attractive drink without any kind of sticky mouthfeel, so there is no tannins involved. And then a question may well be that if you use different types of grape varieties, then you may be blending or making assemblage from these to obtain the final blend. And then you go through the winemaking processes in terms of making sure there is clarity, so you're fining, clarification, filtering, and then you package and bottle the wine. Let us have a look at then red wine making, because of course the significant difference will be about the extraction of the color, and that's what we need to pay attention to. Now the color is always in the skin, and that's what we will need to be working with, right? So that has become, I think, quite apparent during the rosé winemaking. As I said, most of the time the berries will be destemmed, but some whole bunch fermentation may take place in some wineries. Typically, these would be thinner skinned varieties where a bit of extraction from the stalks may be desirable, but that needs to be very carefully managed. And then after crushing, when you've crushed the berries, you will have, as you can see, maceration, alcoholic fermentation, and maceration again. So, as I said, the color is in the skin, and what you want to do is that you want to start to extract the color, and you want to achieve a sufficient depth of color during the winemaking process. So there is the so-called pre-alcoholic fermentation maceration, when normally the crushed berries and the liquid is kept at a cool temperature to avoid the fermentation to kick in. And because the berries have been crushed, so the skin is not intact anymore. The skin is floating, if you think about it, an acidic, sugary liquid. So the acids will start to disintegrate the cells, the membranes of the cells in the skin, thereby releasing the anthocyanins or the color. Now, this is normally a shorter period of time, and then the temperature is slightly increased, and also the fermentation kicks in. During the fermentation, of course, you've got an increasing level of alcohol, right? So you had an acidic juice. Now you also have an increasing level of alcohol in it. As the alcohol is increasing, the extraction of the color is becoming stronger, because acid and alcohol extract color very well from the skin by disintegrating the cells even faster. Now, as we said, we will want to control, of course, the temperature, because the faster it is, the harsher the extraction. Once the fermentation finishes, then normally you don't end up with the sufficient level of color that you want for the red wine. So that's when we talk about the maceration or post-alcoholic fermentation maceration. And this maceration will be, you will be applying different techniques of how much color you extract and over what period of time. Some of the wineries, classically in Bordeaux, will be leaving the wine on skin, so the macerating, for maybe 14 to 21 days. To achieve a really good depth of the color, because with Bordeaux wines, that's the expectation, and that's the standard that you want to achieve. In some instances, it may be a shorter period of time, because simply it's a lighter style wine, and that's what we want to achieve. Also, the more you extract the tannins, the more you build the mouthfeel. So just imagine when you've got a cup of hot water and or 3 cups in front of you, and you put in the green tea bags. You take out the first one after 10 seconds, you take out the second cup after half a minute, and you leave the third cup in for 2 minutes. The third cup will be a lot deeper in color, but also when you taste it compared to cup number 1, it will be quite tannic and quite gripping on the palate, okay? So that's going to be different. How can you achieve? The first one is that by nature of the how the skin behaves, it will be floating on top of the liquid. So simply, if you want the extraction to happen, you punch it down. So practically, you've got the massive tanks, and you've got an implement which is more or less like a circle with a stick at the end, and you punch down the so-called cap, which is practically the skin floating at top of the juice. So that's the punch down. Now, how often you punch it down during a day will be impacting on how much you extract, and also the tannins, as well as how, what speed you punch it in. So that's going to be factors to consider. Then you may also want to keep the cap not at the top, but fully submerged. So you normally would have the same circumference of a metal that helps to push down the cap, keep it submerged, and that's how you extract it. And then the last method that you can use is that actually when you've got the tank, from the level of the juice, you extract the juice and you pump it back on top of the cap so that the cap is being constantly by this liquid coming back into the tank, being submerged. And how much speed and therefore how much pressure you apply when, if you've got larger speed, then the contact and the pressure will be larger on the cap when it is submerging. That's again going to impact the extraction. So there are quite a few considerations to make during this process in terms of what method you pick, how long you use it for, how frequently you do it, and what pressure or what speed you apply. It will all be impacting on your extraction of color and also the tannins. Once you achieve sufficient extraction and your maceration period is finished, then you will be pressing the grapes to extract the juice, the remaining juice, and then it comes to aging that we are going to consider in more detail over the coming slides, as well as you need to obviously fine and filter and then get ready for bottling. So we said that before we get to fining and filtering, we may want to age some of these wines, or we can mature them if you like. Now, what kind of considerations do we want to make? The first one is normally with white wines is the most visible, but red wines may also be left on lees, is the maturation on lees, or with the French expression when you see it on a bottle of wine that it was made with the sur-lie method. Now, when the fermentation finishes, then the first 24-48 hour period, you will be having quite a rough particles floating that nicely as the movement of the juice is coming to a standstill, because during fermentation the liquid is moving a fair bit. Then it's going to settle down, and then you take the juice off from the tank and you put it into a new one. So this is when you say that you rack it off from the gross lees, so GROSS lees, and that is the that is when you will have the liquid still with tiny particles. These are the bodies of the yeast cells, and that is the fine lees, and that will take quite a lot of time to sink to the bottom. And if it is left at the bottom, then you may make the choice to actually stir it, as you can see it on the top photo. If you stir the lees, then it will become this cloud. This is very, very fine material, and then it will be impacting on the flavor, so it will have that more creamy character of the wine. Now, for example, if you think about the Loire Valley Muscadet wines, Muscadet sur-lie wines, is because the acidity is higher. So normally one way of making or polishing the edges of, so to say, of the higher acid content is to give this softer mouthfeel to the wine through the sur-lie method. Then, of course, a very popular consideration to make is whether you want to oak age, barrel age a wine or not. Now, with barrel aging, you've got lots of different considerations and the impact that it will lead to. There are two major impacts that you achieve through barrel aging. Number one is the most obvious, will be the flavor impact. Because you put it into an oak, into a living material, that you will be introducing different spices. These will be normally dependent on the type of the oak. So either French or American oak, and these are French and American oak because the given species of oak is indigenous to either France or to the US. we'll be introducing with French oak, these will be much more the cedar, pine, and savory type of aromas, whereas with American oak, you introduce more the coconut and vanilla type of flavors, so sweeter spices. That's number one. There's also a difference, interestingly, Justin's footnote, between the price of French and American oak. So French oak tends to be about 25–30% more expensive than American oak. So again, dependent on at what price point you will be selling your wine, you may make a different choice. Talking of price, of course, you may also need to make a choice between whether you use barrels or you use staves, as you can see in the middle, or on the left-hand side, you can see various sizes of chips. Clearly, if you're selling a Grand Cru wine from Bordeaux, you will be able to afford to have barrels and use them. Just to put it into context, a French oak barrel costs about €1,000. And if you talk about the barrique size in Bordeaux with about 225 liters, it's very quick to calculate that 1 liter of wine that has been oak aged will cost you, if it is 100% new oak, will cost you about €4, right? So that's the cost of oak aging. Plus, of course, you will need to hold on to the liquid in your winery as stock that you can't sell straight away. Now, if you use staves or chips, then of course the cost will be moving down. And if you use American oak, then that will again moderate it. And in addition to the flavor and the price considerations, you also need to bear in mind that oak as wood as a material is porous. So it means that even though you fill up the barrel fully, there will be some micro amount of oxygen getting through the wood, and that will, in particular with red wine, have the aging, so it will have to soften tannins up. If we remember that during the first session with me, we talked about decanting red wines to soften the tannins up. That is more or less like an accelerated, on steroids kinds of impact when you serve the wine. However, when you've got the fresh new red wine in the cellar that is quite highly tannic and you've extracted a lot of it, then no wonder that, for example, Bordeaux will be aging it for about 18 months before at least it is shown to the press as well or released, and then it will be aged further on. So this micro amount of oxygen helps to soften tannins. Of course, you can also use different vessels than oak barrels. And I have put on a few different photos here. If you want to avoid any impact on the flavor and you want a very inert or in other words, a material that does not let oxygen through, then you can opt for stainless steel tanks. And then different materials, so you could also use concrete, as you can see. The concrete egg, that's a new shape that has been introduced not such a long time ago. And you may also use a shape that is called amphora that was actually introduced about 6,000 years ago in Georgia for winemaking. That is normally made from clay, so both concrete and clay are porous materials similarly to oak, so they will have again the impact on the tannic structure. Last consideration you make in terms of aging and maturation is how long you want to keep that wine in any of these vessels. So if the longer you keep it in barrel, the more contact it will have and the more intense the impact is. Let us move on to the next step. I talked about finding and clarification, so that we want to get the wine ready for drinking. The wine is ready for drinking even when it is in barrel. However, consumers will have the expectation that when you hold up a glass of wine, that they will be nice, bright, no no elements that disturb the visual impact. So what would disturb the visual impact? First of all, you talk about proteins. These proteins are suspended in the liquid, so you will not be able to see them. However, bear in mind that from the cellar, the wine will need to be moved, right, for bottling, for transport and consumption. So there will be varying levels of temperature. So if the temperature drops to quite cold levels, which may well happen when you move the wine out from the cellars in Europe in the winter, then the proteins will be dispersing. So practically they appear in the wine and they look like as if it was a bit cloudy, as if you had a few drops of milk dropped in, and that becomes visually disturbing. In terms of taste, it does not impact anything. It just simply doesn't look appealing, and that's why we want to fine the wine. You can use different materials. So, for example, egg white is a classic one because you put egg whites into the red wine, you stir it, and because they are oppositely charged electrostatically, the negative and positive will hang together of the egg white and the protein. They become heavy, they sink to the bottom of the barrel, and you can rack off the juice, not having proteins left in there anymore. But you also may use casein, which is made from dairy, milk, isinglass from fish, gelatin, and you can use also a process clay filter called bentonite. You also may want to stabilize the wine because there are a number of things that may cause troubles. First of all, there is a tartaric acid, so tartrates may form. And when tartrates form in cold weather, then practically they appear in the form of small crystals, which look almost like glass splinters at the bottom of the bottle. These are not injurious to health, they don't cause any flavor impact, but because consumers don't know this, that's why we remove these, because they may cause issues and complaints, especially in retail environment. You may also want to make sure that you filter out bacteria and yeast, simply to avoid that these yeast would start to re-ferment your wine if there is any sugar left in it. So, for example, if you talk about a semi-dry or semi-sweet wine, then that's definitely something to avoid, because otherwise bottles or containers will, as if it starts to re-ferment, then the carbon dioxide is increasing the size of the container and may explode. Of course, the flavor impact is there as well. And what you want to avoid is that your sliced white apple starts to turn garny and oxidize. So if there is any dissolved oxygen in the wine, then by adding a bit of sulfur dioxide to the liquid, it will tie down the oxygen and therefore avoid oxidation of your wine. So that's how you fine and stabilize the wine, and then you're getting it ready for bottling or ready for packaging. Now, in terms of packaging, I have put on a number of different types, because I think it's really important to bear in mind that, of course, bottle is the primary choice, but there may be the PET bottles, so the plastic bottles. Also, you see the Vino on the left-hand side bottom, you see what we call the bag-in-box. So practically, there is a vacuum-packed 3 or 6 liter plastic bag of wine in a box, very easy to carry and easy to serve. Normally, when you've got a larger quantity, you can see also more lifestyle packaging pouch that you can take easily in bags, or Tetra Pak. There is always a question of what is the best choice. There's no single best choice. If you're working in a fine dining restaurant, it's very unlikely you will choose Tetra Pak or a PET bottle or a pouch. If you're working in a retail environment and you're selling a very modestly priced, low or entry-level wine, then it's very likely you will need to spend, you will have less money to spend on packaging, and what you want is maybe a PET bottle or a bag-in-box. Equally, you need to remember what your consumers prefer. So in some markets, for example in Scandinavia, having bag-in-box for higher quality wine may well, does happen simply because it's an environmentally friendly way of packaging and is easy to carry. Also in Scandinavia, where at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a large part of population which was struggling with alcoholism, clinging bottles are socially not accepted, and if you use a bag-in-box, those will not be clinging when someone is going home from the retail outlet. At the same time, of course, if you are in a fine dining restaurant, you would definitely not want to open a pouch or a PET bottle, but there also not only the wine and the quality of the wine that's important, but also the style and how you serve it, because you're creating an experience, right? So different packaging will suit different segments of the market, and dependent on where you work in hospitality, you will have very different choices. And with that, I have come to the end of today's session and would open up it to questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter. We have a couple of questions over the last 1 hour, and I have just mentioned a few of those relevant questions in the chat box. We would just like to see in the chat box, Mr. Peter, I've just forwarded a few of our students' questions over there.
Yeah. So the first is about what yeast is used in fermentation of winemaking. As I have said, there is a very wide variety of choices if you go for commercial yeast, and that's will be really dependent on the temperature of your cellar, on the sugar content of your juice, how much alcohol you want to achieve. So a massive selection is offered by the oenological suppliers. It's really good to check out with them. Question 2 that I can see, how many times pressing is done for white wine making? That's an interesting question, because pressing, there will be one pressing, and with pressing, what you pay attention to is what is the final pressure you will want to apply. Because if you press too harsh, then you will press out the last drop of liquid for sure. But by doing that, you may actually be risking that you're crushing those seeds and or pips and extracting the harsh polyphenols or tannins. So that's what you want to avoid. So it's more a question of how long you press and at what pressure you apply. What is the duration of maceration for preparing rosé wines? So as I was referring to, some of these wines, when you use the bleeding off method or saignée, then there will be no maceration at all. If you have a very, very, very short maceration, maybe just a few hours, that's typically used for vin gris, where it's almost white and there is only a tiny bit of color. And then it will be dependent really on what depths you want to achieve and how much. So it can be from 6 to 9 hours, or some rosé winemakers may want to focus on creating a richer palate, and that may be slightly longer, but normally it's less than 1 day. And question number 4, which oak is used for white wine and red wine maturation? For white and red wine maturation, as I mentioned, French oak and American oak are used, dependent on what flavor you want to introduce to the wine. There will be clear choices that typically, for example, in Bordeaux and Burgundy, it's French oak. But for example, in case of Rioja wines, it is American oak that is used. So it may well be also a question of tradition, but the choice is always up to the winemaker. Next question, number 5. What is the difference in flavor characteristics of wine stored in stainless steel tanks versus oak barrels? Let me take a sip of tea. So the difference between stainless steel and oak barrels, will be that, first of all, in oak barrels, you will have either the French or American oak type of spicing on the wine, whereas in a stainless steel wine, you will have much more the fruitiness, the crisp nature of that wine unoaked in character. Second, it will also be different because in oak, you will also have oxygen working with it in micro amounts, whereas in stainless steel, it will be very much crisp and focusing on the fruits rather than anything else, or a tiny bit of impact of oxygen on the tannins. So it is always a crisper, fruit-forward style in stainless steel, because that's what you want to keep the purity. What is the influence of wine in screw caps versus wine sealed in cork bottles? So in terms of the closure, cork is a natural material, as we said, and that's the only gateway for oxygen to get through into a bottle of wine, because oxygen will not get through the glass itself. So there will be a micro amount of oxygen going through, and that will contribute to the aging. Number one, as we have mentioned during the last session, the wine bottle needs to be on the side to make sure that it's sufficiently wet and moist, so that it remains expanded, so there is not excess oxygen left through next to or in between the cork and the bottleneck. In terms of screw caps, one thing that you can think of as a difference is that because the screw cap can perfectly close at the top of the glass bottle and the screw cap itself, which has a lining material in it, that can be completely disclosing oxygen. But again, the choice is there what the liner is, so in terms of oxygen permeation, and that may again influence it. But normally that would be different. And of course, with oak, you may also have what we call the cork taint issue. Cork taint is a trichloryl anisole, so a chlorine compound that is naturally carried by the wood, and that impacts on the wine and makes it an off flavor. Normally nowadays, about maybe 1 to 3% of wines are corked, despite improved technology. This will not happen with screw cap wines because of the screw cap carrying it, but don't be mistaken that even screw cap wines may be corked, because the wine may have been in contact with some cork taint in the winery or so it carries it from somewhere else. Next question, how to measure the pH value in wine grapes? So that would normally require that you take sample to a laboratory, because pH measurement will be a more complex process for the laboratory than anything else. So that is one, and there may be pH sort of straps that you can buy and use for very quick approximate measurements, but it will be a lab evaluation. For making of rosé wine, how long the grape skins are left with the must? So as I answered during the previous question, it may be from nothing to a few hours, dependent on what mouth we want to achieve. And the next question is, what is the effect of grapes in vineyards on ineffective pruning? So if you don't do your pruning well, then that will impact your maturation. It may impact on the amount of grapes you produce. So it can have a underripe or overripe character, dependent on how much how much the sun is impacting it. It may be overcropping, so it may be more dilute. So definitely pruning will be an important decision in the vineyard. What is the perfect time for harvest for wine grapes, and is it the same for all locations and countries? Good. I think this is going to be a good question to close today's session with, because that's where we have started, so it gives a nice frame for our discussion. And as I mentioned, the choice of picking time will be different, not only in different regions in the same country, but even maybe in different parts of the same region, dependent on the maturity, and that will be really dependent on how your vineyard is exposed to sun, and how the ripening has progressed. So even in the same vine region, picking may be different at different producers, and that will be dependent on, have you achieved sufficient sugar? Is there enough acidity in there? Is it too much, or is there still enough acidity? And what about the phenolic ripeness? Once these elements are in place, what we call the physical, so the sugar and the phenolic ripeness, that's when it's the time to pick the grapes and to start the winemaking process. So.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mr. Peter. I think probably all our students are excited to be a part of this session, and their answers, the queries are answered. So I'm sure, like, they're not having any further clarifications, and
Great.
We really look forward to see you again in the next class for sure.
Absolutely, thanks so much, and please remember to read up your books and make sure you go through your notes from there as well, so that you just beef up what we have learned today. Thank you so much, and
Absolutely.
see you next time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter. Just one request. Some of our students have requested probably if you could share the presentations with them, so it will help them for as a learning material.
Sure, we'll do that. Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.